Thank you very much for being here today. My name is Ref, and I'm one of the pixel artists working at Chucklefish. Today I'll be talking about making pixel art for games. I started making pixel art about 7 years ago while I was still in high school. Back then, I was just doing some small commissions in between my studies. Is this not working? Oh, there we go. OK, sorry, this was supposed to be before. But as time went on, I started accepting more and more work and committing to bigger projects until I became a full-time artist by the end of 2020. For the next couple of years, I worked for multiple indie games and personal projects from my home in Argentina, learning a lot about how pixel art is made and applied to game development and design. Until November of 2020, when I found my way to the Chucklefish team and I relocated to London to focus on making pixel art for Witchbrook, their upcoming live sim pixel art game. When I first got into pixel art, I was just interested in replicating the art from the games that I grew up playing. But over the years, as I started to understand game design better, I realized that there's much more to it than just that nostalgia for retro games. Pixel art is a strange medium with lots of challenges and limitations, but it's also really fun. There's something very satisfying about being able to create an artwork from a lot of small pieces and having the ability to control what every part of the image looks like to that level. It also really makes you want to improve, because to get better, all you need to do is figure out better ways to place the pixels. Unlike in traditional mediums, where it's much more important to get better at physical skills, like being able to use a tool correctly or drawing smooth lines with a pencil or a brush. In pixel art, pretty much the entire result depends only on your knowledge. Of course, having better tools or better software might help you create things faster, but it's not necessary to get started. And I have known many great artists that create really great things using just some free software and a mouse. This talk is aimed at people who are interested in pixel art as a career, but it should also have a lot of useful information for anyone who's working on a pixel art game, because understanding more about the way that the art in your game is made can help you make better design decisions in the long run. Part 1, the limitations of pixel art. There are many challenges and limitations when working with pixel art. If you're not careful, you might end up with wonky lines, weird visual artifacts, confusing shapes, or noisy textures. Sometimes the shape that you want to make looks weird when turned into pixels. Sometimes there just isn't enough space to include what you want. It almost feels like the canvas is fighting against you whenever you want to draw something. And these things used to drive me crazy when I got started. I found it very frustrating that every time that I wanted to draw something, I had to go through this cleaning step at the end. And when you first come across these things, it's normal to have a similar reaction and think of pixel art as a very rigid and limited medium. But eventually, I realized that that's the entire point. Making pixel art is solving a puzzle and trying to create great things despite the limitations. I like to think of it as having to draw an image through a layer of noise. Oh, this doesn't work. This one is supposed to have 2 more things. It's an animation. Sorry. Oh, well, it's fine. Just imagine that there's a version of this in pixel art to the side and a downscale version to the left. Anyway, I like to think of it as having to draw an image through a layer of noise. You can choose anything to draw, but it will be distorted and details will be lost. If we were to simply resize the image instead, it would look blurry and undefined. Pixel art is solving the puzzle of making a small image look clean, and we managed to achieve this by using visual illusions. For example, when we want to draw a line in pixel art, we're not really drawing a line. We're just placing pixels in a regular pattern, hoping that they will be read as a single stroke. Your goal as a pixel artist is to use visual tricks and illusions to make things look more readable. And when you start to think of pixel art this way, you'll find that the real limitation is not what you can draw, as it can be anything. The limitation is how clear you can make it look. Of course, this puzzle gets harder at smaller size, because it's harder to squeeze detail when there's less pixels available. But at common game resolutions, I have found that not only can you represent most things in pixel art, but you can do it in dozens of different ways and styles. There is really no reason for your game to look the same as all the other pixel art games just because it's done with pixel art. And the way we managed to do this is by improving the readability of our assets. Part 2, making your assets more readable. When you start looking into pixel art resources, you will come across a lot of weirdly named concepts and techniques like jaggies, anti-aliasing, and it's easy to get overwhelmed and start using them everywhere without thinking too much about it. In reality, all of these techniques were invented to solve very specific problems, and they are not supposed to be applied to everything. Jaggies, for example, are usually taught as these broken patterns that can appear when we're trying to draw something, like a line or a curve, as some kind of mistake that has to always be avoided. But actually, jaggies are just a way to imply a different shape. And sometimes we do want that broken shape, like when we're drawing something that isn't smooth. For example, in this bird, I have intentionally used a broken line to emphasize the shape of the curve of the wing. Another technique that is often misunderstood is anti-aliasing, which is those intermediate pixels that we use to smooth lines. There is actually a lot more to anti-aliasing than what it is given credit for. The way it works is that our brains read lighter pixels as being somehow smaller or thinner. And this can be exploited a lot to squeeze detail out of small sprites by placing these lighter pixels whenever we want to have a transition. And it's also a great way to give an extra kick to a sprite. Thinking of these techniques as tools we can use instead of rules we always have to follow can give us a lot of freedom, and will even allow us to create different styles by choosing when we want to use them or not. Making your pixel art more readable is all about being intentional about the way that you make it and understanding why you're doing the things that you're doing. Here's some tips that should make this easier. Tip 1, thinking with clusters. All sprites are made out of a collection of shapes of a single color each. We call these shapes clusters, and it's really important to try to keep the number of them relatively small if it matches the style, because it gets harder to clean a sprite and make it readable when we use too many. Keeping an eye on clusters can be especially useful for pixel art animation, because instead of having to animate the whole thing at once, we can plan the general movement and then animate each cluster separately. Some clusters will deform just a little and be really rigid, while other clusters will actually deform a lot. So having a small number of them can make our work much faster. Tip 2, simplification always helps. Usually, the easiest solution when your sprites look a little noisy is to merge and remove clusters that don't matter as much. And even if you did manage to fit all the details that you wanted into your sprite, simplification can still be a good idea, as at low resolutions and seeing it small in a screen, it can get hard to parse. When figuring out the style for a project, we can adjust how much simplification we use to achieve different styles as well. But try to keep in mind that committing to a more detailed style is not necessarily better, especially if it's going to be animated later on, because you will have to carry those details through every frame. Tip 3, keep your silhouettes clean. Sometimes the reason why an artwork doesn't read right is not the amount of detail, but the angle and position in which it is drawn. For characters, this means adjusting the pose so their silhouettes are easier to read, but it also applies to objects. We can move things around in a scene just a little bit to give them space to breathe, or nudge the details inside of a sprite just a few pixels to avoid unfortunate overlaps. My favorite example of this is double outlines, which is something that happens when you have two sprites with outlines next to each other, creating this weird dark rectangle between them. I try to remove this as much as I can, but sometimes it's a little hard to avoid. Tip 4, sometimes you just need more space. If you have tried to simplify your sprite and move things around as much as possible, but it still doesn't read well, you might want to consider resizing the sprite and making it bigger. For a lot of projects, this is difficult because it would mean breaking the style or sometimes you're just like fixed to some rules and sizes that you have to follow. But I have found that even then, it's worth keeping this in mind because whenever you can get away with it, having more space will almost always get you cleaner results. In some cases, it's even possible to enlarge just a few sections of the sprite that you want to focus on, although this does depend on the style that you're going for. Like some games which have the heads of their characters bigger, so you can define the features better. Part 3. Building a scene. You can find Pixar games that look really different and provoke really different feelings, but still work great. There isn't a single art style that will always look best. A dark game with more mature themes might be enhanced by assets with spikier shapes and details, while a more friendly game with a more relaxed theme might look better with rounder shapes and a simpler rendering. Finding a visual style and being consistent with it can really elevate a game by making your assets seem like they belong together. And the way we've managed to find this visual style is by making very intentional decisions about the way that we make it. Instead of just creating one asset after the other hoping that they will look good together, try to decide on a set of rules that all your assets should follow, like the colors that you want to use and the kinds of shapes that you want to see more of in your game. Finding a style is all about making choices. With this in mind, a good way to start finding a style is to make a mockup. A mockup is just a single image or two where you try to picture what your game is going to look like ahead of time. They're a great way to find design flaws before you commit to anything, and they're also a really great way to practice and to experiment with different visual styles. Over the years, I have done a lot of mockups of popular games, trying to figure out what they could look like in pixel art. I have found this to be a great way to practice, and the results are always really fun. The great thing about making this is that you are forced to practice a bit of everything: characters, environments, objects, interface, all while trying to tie them together with a consistent visual style. There isn't enough time for me to go step by step through the entire process of making a mockup, but I can give you some general guidelines that should help you find a style as you make one. Tip 1, how to start. Depending on the kind of game that you're making, there's a few different approaches to starting a mockup. Sometimes I like to start by just making a rough sketch, trying to figure out what my scene is going to look like, as kind of a rough plan. But I have found that this approach only really works when you already know what you want things to look like in the end, and it's not that useful when you're first exploring a style. For those, I like to start by making a single first sprite that will serve as a guide when I try to figure out the style of the rest of things. It's always easier to start from a small part rather than trying to tackle everything at once. This first sprite can be anything, but you should try to prioritize what matters more for your game. If you're making a game where characters are really important, you might want to start with a character. And if you're making a game where exploration is really important, then you might want to focus on an environment asset, like a tree, or in this case, a button. Because this is the first image, you should feel free to experiment a lot as you draw more. You should feel free to experiment a lot, because as you draw more of the scene, it will get harder to make changes, as you would have to update everything that you have done before. So try to take as many risks as you can in this step, and give yourself plenty of options to choose from. Tip 2, finding a shape a shape language. The first choice that you need to make is, and perhaps the most important one, is the shape language. You should ask yourself if the characters in your scene should be sharp or round, if they should be cartoony or proportionate, and what their silhouettes should look like. Your knowledge of art fundamentals plays a really big role here, and having a consistent shape language can be a great tool to establish a mood for your game and give it some personality. It can also be a great way to communicate more information to the player, like having dangerous objects be sharp while more friendly objects and characters are round. 3, choosing the amount of detail. The next step is choosing how busy we want our scenes to be. The amount of objects that we have on screen will determine how crowded our game looks. It's important to note that a game with more stuff is not necessarily better, as it can be a little overwhelming and hard to compose. Plus, it makes production times much longer. We can also play with the balance between the amount of stuff in the scene and the detail of each asset. For example, your mockup could contain a lot of objects, but if the objects themselves are really simple, it might still look balanced. Likewise, we could have just a few detailed assets. Tip 4, choosing a color palette. The amount of unique colors that you use will allow you to add more or less information. It's common advice to use a small palette in pixel art, but a bigger palette is not necessarily a bad thing. With a bigger palette, you can squeeze in a lot of effects and backlights and metal shines and a lot of things that you couldn't with a smaller palette. The problem is that when you're a beginner, it's hard to achieve these things without making things look blurry or really noisy, which is why it's usually recommended for beginners to start with a small palette and build your way up as you get more comfortable with pixel art and with color theory. When making a game, I think that a better approach to color is, instead of having a single game palette with 20 or 30 colors that limit what you can do, have an amount of colors per material. This is what we call material ramps, and they are a great way to keep the style of your game consistent without limiting the amount of colors. In this example, every material uses 7 colors, but I could have used 5 or 6, depending on the style that I wanted. The tips that I have mentioned so far, creating a first sprite to experiment with, choosing a shape language, an amount of detail, and your color palette, are relatively common advice when it comes to finding a style. But I have a few more technical things that I also want to mention. The first one is picking an outline style. Outlines can be a really useful way to make your objects and characters stand out against the background. They also make things look much more solid. However, outlines come at a big cost in pixel art. They take up space. In a 16 by 16 asset, more than 10% of the height is dedicated to just the outline, and we could use that space if we didn't have one. Outlines can also make things look really flat and break the illusion of volume, especially if we use a completely opaque outline, which is why a lot of games use a shaded outline, where you paint part of the outline a lighter color to imply more three-dimensionality. Some games go a step further because they either use no outline or they use a thick outline with 2 pixels or more, which achieves a really cartoony style that really works for some genres. We should also consider what the interior outlines of our sprites are going to look like, because having really dark outlines inside of a sprite can make it confusing or look a little flat. So it's a common approach to have lighter outlines inside of our sprites, or just skip them entirely. We can get an extra layer of stylization by the way that we polish the final image, and the pixel techniques that we choose to use or not. Specifically, I want to talk about these 3: anti-aliasing, dithering, and texture. I talked a little bit about anti-aliasing before, as these small squares that we use to smooth out lines and curves. But we can also use anti-aliasing to achieve different styles. A scene with a lot of anti-aliasing will look much softer, while a scene with less will look sharper and more rough. You should think of it as a spectrum that you can turn up or down in order to get different results. We could also just have a small amount of anti-aliasing to just fix readability issues without making the sprite look blurry. The second technique that I want to talk about is dithering. Dithering is a way of creating transitions between two colors when you don't want to use a third color, or you can't, by creating an interlaced pattern between them. This one is funny to me because when I started making pixel art many years ago, I didn't really like it. I just thought it didn't look good, and I couldn't find a lot of cases where I wanted to use it. It also has a huge cost because it tends to add noise to our images and make them harder to read. I eventually found that when used properly, dithering can be a really great tool to achieve a very unique style, as long as we keep the amount of it reasonable. So I started to practice how to do it, and in that process, I realized something else that is really useful about dithering. You can dither anything to create a transition. It doesn't just have to be pixels. For example, in this scene, I have used dithering to transition between the dark tiles and the lighter tiles, which I think works much better than having an abrupt line in the middle. This same idea can be applied to other things, like bricks or trees. It's a great way to create transitions when we only have two things to use. Before I move on to the last topic, I want to make a quick mention of texture. Texture is when we try to create a pattern to imply different materials. I could talk for a really long time about how to make textures in pixel art, but just to touch on it quickly, the most important thing when you're making a texture is to have it adapt to the thing that it is placed on. For example, in this dragon, if I had just used a pattern that I applied on top, it would end up looking a little flat, instead of having the scales follow the shape of the body. We can also adjust how much texture we use in different parts of the sprite to give interest to certain points. 7, making use of your game style. To close things off, I want to talk about making good use of the style that you have created. It's important to know that establishing a style doesn't mean that you have to make the same decisions everywhere. You can change the rules in some assets to communicate information to the player. A common example of this is when games use a softer palette with less contrast for their backgrounds, so that you can clearly see the characters and objects on top. This also has something to do with a real thing that happens, which is that in real life, objects that are further away tend to lose contrast, while objects that are closer to us are much more defined. It's also possible to establish a set of visual cues in our game to communicate information. For example, if the player knows that every interactable object has a black outline, then when they don't see one, it makes it more apparent that that thing is part of the background or is not as important. If we are clever with the way that we apply these things, we can get away with things that would be really confusing in other contexts. Another example of this is when games play with perspective. If we always respect the perspective of our game, except for a few cases, then it will make those objects stand out and add some interest to the scene. In summary, pixel art has a lot of challenges and limitations, but that's what makes it fun. It doesn't require special tools or expensive software to get started, but it can make the process faster. The goal in pixel art is to create readable assets despite the limitations that come with the medium. Pixel art techniques are just ways to solve problems, not rules that we always have to follow. We can create many different visual styles, but by the way that we can create many different visual styles in pixel art, and to find a style, we need to make intentional decisions about how we create our assets. Mockups can be a great tool to make this process easier, and finally, once we find this visual style, it can be a really powerful tool to communicate more information to the player if we're creative with the way that we use it. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the talk. Sí. Termino siendo más corto de lo que creí.
Tenemos tiempo para algunas preguntas, o sea que si queréis decir algo, levantad la mano.
Ups.
Maravilla. Ahí, vale. Gracias.
Sorry.
Sorry, I'm curious, when you do dithering, is it random, or is there a pattern to follow?
So when you're making dithering, there's actually hundreds of patterns that you can use. If you're clever with the patterns that you make, you can actually imply different textures and materials. For example, I really like using more like dynamic shapes that kind of break off from a cluster and like get smaller as it goes away to just imply some kind of lighting. But yeah, there's actually a lot of ways to do dithering, and it's a really complex topic that kind of merges into texture as well. But yeah, you can also use random dithering, but I think that's kind of, it can look good, but for most games, I think it goes against what you want, which is to keep readability and make sure that your assets are easy to read. If the placement is random, you're going to have less control.
Hi.
Hello.
Do you have like any tips for making tile maps?
Tile maps. So I didn't talk about tiles in the talk because I thought that it would last a little longer than it did. But tiles are really interesting, and so the software that I use is Sprite, and it actually has a tile feature now in the latest beta. I don't have any techniques in mind right now, but usually I just start by like making the texture. For example, if I'm making a grass tile or something like that, I try to start with the main texture that you're going to see the most. And I spend a lot of time on that texture before trying to make the transitions. Because if you look at a scene, a lot of the time you just have the same texture repeated a lot of times. And if you can get away with it, I also like to make a lot of variations of that. Like if you have a grass texture, instead of having the same tile everywhere, try to have variations of it, like with the leaves of the grass being bigger in some places and smaller in others, or having less in some sections of the map and more in others, to create focal points and make sure that it doesn't look too much like it's just a repeating pattern.
Okay. Thanks.
No worries.
Given your recommendation to use determined colors and figuring out a color palette when you're working on sprites, what's your thoughts on using layer effects? Like I'm gonna put a multiply layer on this to see like a color, or maybe a shine layer of some kind. Do you use it only for the markup process when you're trying to figure out colors? Do you use them in general to at least, if the project lets you do it, just use it, or do you prefer to just figure out colors yourself by picking them on a color wheel?
So picking colors is a really big topic as well. Over time, I started to use less palettes and less effects, and I started to pick colors manually. But I think that's something that comes with time, and I think that's something that you start to develop. when you're starting out, layer effects and that kind of thing can really be a great tool to just try things out without having to replace every color one by one. Like just applying a layer on top to see, oh, what happens if I switch the hue a little bit to the left, or what happens if I increase the contrast. I think that there's nothing wrong with using them, although I would be careful about using effects like that create gradients, because gradients can really fight against pixel art, at least when you're making the original like PNG. But then, of course, a lot of games do apply gradients on top of the pixel art in-engine, which I think is much less dangerous because you're not like touching the asset itself. But I would recommend trying to keep the original asset as clean as you can. But using those effects to try to figure things out and to try to find what looks best, I think that's totally fine. And I do a lot of the time use like transparency to try things out, like having a layer on top and drawing some random thing on it and applying some transparency to see how those colors affect my sprite and see if it would look better.
Hi. When designing for pixel art, like characters, for example, do you recommend designing them directly in pixel art, or firstly you do it in 2D in Photoshop normal, and then you pass that to pixel art?
I think both approaches are completely valid. In general, nowadays, I tend to just start out with pixels, but for a really long time, I used to draw things in like just an A4 piece of paper and take a photo of them and use that as a sketch that I would draw on top of. Really, as long as I think this is especially useful for characters. As long as you can get your proportions right and your idea right, then the way that you make the sketch doesn't really matter. What matters more is just the way that you polish it. And if you can achieve the same results with different techniques, that's totally fine. I do think that nowadays that I use a drawing tablet, it makes things really much easier when making characters, because I can just sketch the character in a bigger resolution and then shrink it down. But I almost always go through a cleaning step because the poses can sometimes get a little hard to read at small resolutions. So I tend to just like move the limbs a little so that you can see the pose better.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Por ahí atrás.
Hello.
Hello.
Do you know, do you have a favorite artist that you think is overrated? No, not overrated, but underrated?
So
Or that people doesn't know about him?
I do have some favorite artists, but they're very much properly rated. Like Simon Andersen, which is the artist for Owlboy, for example, which I just go crazy every time that I see an image from his work. I don't have a lot of artists in mind that I would consider underrated, but I do think that pixel art in general is a community where maybe names don't go around as much as with other communities. So just to mention a few of my favorite artists, to give something, Simon Andersen and Thomas Feichmer. I think those two might be my favorites. But yeah, I think a really easy way to find a lot of really great artists is to go on places like Pixel Joint and just looking at the Hall of Fame in that website. And you're going to find a lot of really crazy stuff that's done by people that maybe you've never heard the name of before. So yeah.
I'll do a question.
Yeah.
Here. I'm pretty sure I heard you say that you didn't like pixel art when you started. So I'd like to ask, why did you start with this art style if you don't like it, or didn't like it?
So it's not that I didn't like it when I was beginning. I just find it a little frustrating. I wanted to create things like the games that I loved, like the games that I grew up playing. But when I was trying to do it, I found it frustrating that every time that I wanted to draw something, there was this big cleaning step that I had to do for things to look good, and that they would usually turn out really badly. But I think I pushed through that step, and I'm really glad that I did, because I found out that it's a really lovely medium and that it's really fun to do once you understand how it works, and once you understand that those things never really go away. Like there's always going to be like a lot of cleaning up that you don't need to do with other mediums, but that's precisely what makes it interesting.
Thank you.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Aquí.
What do you think about making a fake pixel art like that tells? I mean, it's not fake pixel art, but making a 3D model and then adding a pixel art filter or something like that. Do you think it has the same effect than making it manually, or what do you think?
I think that's really cool, and I have seen some really cool stuff done with that. So I'm not much of a programmer, so I don't know what the technical difficulties with it are or how hard it is to get a clean result out of it. But the times that I've seen it done well, it really looks pretty cool. And if it saves time, I think it's a perfectly valid way of doing things. Although in those examples that I have seen, which I can't really remember the name right now, the final look did feel different, even though it wasn't a bad feeling. It does feel a little different. So I think it depends on what you want your game to look like. And if you want your game to look like pixel art, unless it's a big time save, I would consider it. But yeah, I think they're really nice.
Tendríamos tiempo para una última. Ahí al fondo. Sorry.
Hi. About the software you use, what do you usually use or recommend to tell?
So there's a short and a long answer to this. The short answer is Sprite, which I think has become very much an industry standard. You can find it on Steam, and I think it's also on itch, and there's a way to compile it yourself. I don't know how much it costs, but if you're serious about pixel art, I definitely think that it's worth getting, because it's what a lot of artists use nowadays, so it's easier to share tricks and tips with them. But there's a lot of really great free software around, and I think I had a slide with some software at some point. Like GraphicsScale, for example, which has been around for many years, or if you already own digital software like Photoshop, or if you have Krita, they also can be really good for pixel art, and I think they're great ways to, as like a gateway to it, because a lot of people already have those software, and if you just lower the resolution and toggle a few settings, you can just start making pixel art without having to download anything that you are unfamiliar with. Some alternatives to Sprite if you don't like it, because it does have quite a unique look to it. Pixel Edit is a very popular one. And I believe that Lospec also made a web version if you just want to very quickly see how pixel art feels, just opening a browser.
Well, thank you very much, Ref.
Thank you very much.